I'm going to introduce Joe, but I also want to introduce the purpose of the different talks that we've had, invited speakers to meet with our group. This is part of our ETAI needs assessment milestone, where we have continued to have one-on-one engagement with the various modules to understand key priorities and educational opportunities. And we found that there are commonalities across the modules. And so rather than doing independent one-off types of engagement, we have decided to do a monthly speaker series. And so we had Burke Ouston speak in June. We had, I'm dropping his name, Aaron
Goldenberg.
Thank you, Khadija. And now we have Joe, one of our own colleagues, who will be talking with us today about work that, I'm getting interrupted. So anyway, we're working on building capacity across our AI Ready membership, specific to the ethical, legal, and social responsibilities that we have. And so we would love to have as many folks in our AI Ready join us on these Tuesdays. So it is part of our educational milestone. It's my pleasure to introduce Joe Yracheta, who is a scientist, executive director working with the Native BioData Consortium within the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. And Joe has been working with us with the ethical, trustworthy AI module. He also is working with the data module and teaming module. He has his master's in pharmaceutics and bioethics from University of Washington in Seattle, finishing his doctorate in public health and environmental health and engineering from Johns Hopkins. And I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Joe, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. So let me know if these scroll through or not. Just check it.
We're seeing it. Yeah, now it's in full view now. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Joseph Yracheta. The title of my talk is The Dissonance Between Altruism and Scientific Extraction for and from the Amerindigenous. So if you guys don't know, there's a lot of words for American Indians. None of them are perfect. Native American, American Indian, First Nations, in Latin America, ex pueblos originarios, which is original peoples. In anthropology, it's usually Amerindian or Amerindian. I'm choosing Amerindigenous to put us all in one genetic or familial bucket, if you were. And the reason is because in terms of biomedical research, the Americas has been divided up into Euro-colonial borders. These are not our borders. And then we're further divided by a concept called mestizaje, or those people that have some European ancestry, that usually it becomes sort of a class and caste system where people who are, so it's kind of the opposite in the United States. So in the United States, if you're one drop black, you're black. In Latin America, if you're one drop white, you're white. And so it really puts a lot of pressure on those Latin American countries to identify as white, and to the detriment of the indigenous people in those countries. So just for example, in the United States, Native Americans are about 5% of the population, whereas in Mexico, Native Americans are between, depending on who you believe, between 11 and 44% of the population. So, and those numbers fluctuate depending on how they do the census and what the political advantage is to having or not having indigenous people counted in those countries or not. So there is no real Native American government in the Americas except for Bolivia at the moment. And of course, here in the United States and Canada, there's limited sovereignty for those American Indian nations. And that's where they are different from other minorities in the United States, whether they're East Asian, South Asian, African American, or Latino. Native Americans do not represent a minority. They're not a minority. They are a political body formed into governments that make up nations. So that's something that people don't often understand. So this is just me. I grew up in Chicago. I'm a late bloomer. I'm still trying to get my DRPH from Johns Hopkins. I got my master's at 48 from the UW Seattle in a combined program of pharmaceutics and bioethics under Wiley Burke and Ken Thummel. So generally, I have a master's in pharmacogenomics. I spent a lot of time at the UW-Madison in the veterinary school and in human transplant immunology. And then I graduated from Loyola in Chicago. Um, so here on the right, you see all the reasons, and I believe in these reasons as a scientist, for having open data. It makes things more generalizable. You have more statistical rigor. You have the potential for egalitarianism and altruism. You have increased knowledge and expertise, having more eyeballs on the same data. So interdisciplinarity is part of it. You have possible rapid discovery and, of course, economic benefit. This is the reason why we are kind of moving to this open data and data sharing environment. However, with tribes and underrepresented populations, they weren't really consulted, and they end up becoming bioproperty of a majority Euro-descended nation here in Canada and the United States, which is not the way it should be, but that's the way we're seen, as we're bioproperty. And I'll get into that more in a few slides later. But tribes right now don't have the capacity and capability to do this work for themselves. They don't have the necessary legal and policy protections. And those that do are some kind of trumped or circumvented by the federal government, saying that those legal and policy protections end at their tribal border. So a big nation like the Navajo Nation has a genetics moratorium, and they have gone outside their jurisdiction to Los Angeles to get their data back and the samples from their people back. And mostly those universities gave the samples back because they didn't want to have the public relations nightmare that Arizona State University had with the Havasupai. But generally, in terms of specific law, their law and policy ends at their tribal border. They don't, if they don't have these things, they don't have technology and infrastructure, they can't increase their political and economic language so that they can protect themselves from the big monster that is the United States. So basically, the United States, instead of treating tribes as France, you wouldn't just go into France and take people's kids or their data. They're treating them as if they're an African American group, which is completely illegal and certainly unethical. So this is kind of a joke in terms of diversity and inclusivity. The majority culture basically says, don't worry, there's new rules, things will be fair from now on. So that, in my opinion, that's what open data is supposed to be, is new rules and things will be fair. But also those same people get to decide what is fair and what's unfair, and they get to judge or adjudicate all claims of inequity. So a little bit about where I am. I'm on Cheyenne River. So South Dakota is one of the states with a very large number of Native Americans. It's about 14% of the population. The total population of South Dakota is just under 1 million people. And there's 9 reservations here in South Dakota. We're on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, and we're right in the middle of the reservation. So the Sioux are divided into 3 related language families: Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. South Dakota has 2 of those groups, Lakota and Dakota. Usually the Nakota are up in Canada. There are some Nakota speakers in the United States, but mostly they're in Canada. And the NBDC is unique. We're a 501c3 nonprofit where we're led by Indigenous scientists and the Indigenous community here. And we're inside the jurisdictional border of an American Indian nation. So that also makes us unique. There are places like the Alaskan Area Specimen Bank, which, hypothetically has governance from the 328 tribes that live there. But the samples themselves are housed in a military secured CDC building. So you have to question whether or not how much the tribes there have actual control of that data and those samples. And then there's, of course, the Strongheart study, which some of you might know has been a 35-year epidemiological study in American Indian heart disease, which has tribal representation from Oklahoma, here in the Dakotas and Arizona. But again, most of the decisions are made by non-natives in terms of that data and those genetic samples. So we find ourselves to be very unique. Just so that if you want to look, this is our YouTube site. We've been featured on Yracheta and on NPR. We've been on the CBC up in Canada. We've made it around the world in terms of our reputation and news portfolio. Our board members, like I said, are all Native. Two of them are here from South Dakota. They're tribal members from here. We have a Navajo board member. We have a Cherokee board member. We have a Hawaiian board member. We have a First Nations board member from Canada. We have a board member who's Maori from New Zealand. We have a board member who's Mexican, who works in San Diego. We have a state-recognized tribal member from North Carolina, and then we have another South Dakota member here from the Pine Ridge Reservation. So our ultimate goal, if you don't know, a lot of Native American data suffers because it's cross-sectional, and it's often not planned together with other types of research like environmental. For instance, in the Navajo Reservation, who were the victims of sort of Oppenheimer and a lot of the uranium mining there, they did two different investigations, one on uranium and radioactive contaminated water there, and they also did one on rare cancers among the Navajo. It wasn't until about 10 years after those two studies were done that they figured out that the rare cancers in the Navajo were not inherent to their genetics, but actually DNA breakage patterns caused by the uranium contamination of the water that the people were drinking. So this is what I'm talking about, is that often with American Indian research funded by the federal government, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So what we want to do is try and go back and repatriate all of that data so that we can try to harmonize that data to make sure that not only is that data inside the control of Indigenous governments, but also that we can put this data to good use and sort of leverage the data that does exist for better design studies in the future. So as I was saying at the beginning, there's a huge lust for Native American data of any kind, and we're often seen as bioproperty or a conquered people. And some of the reason why is because our DNA profiles are very homogeneous, much more homogeneous than the rest of the world, because of the series of bottlenecks that we experienced coming here through the Bering Strait, and then everything that happened after, including European invasion. And after European invasion, you can argue there's been at least three bottlenecks, one of European diseases, then later with European wars of conquest, especially in the United States, kind of going from the East Coast to the Midwest to the West Coast. And then finally, by being put on reservation, that's a whole different selection process and bottleneck that has happened. So in terms of like genetic architecture, homogeneity, and sort of bounce back from these highly damaging selective pressures, we are a treasure trove of information, and it doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet except for maybe Australia and Polynesia. But how we're different from Australia and Polynesia is Polynesia only became isolated about 3,000 years ago. Australia has had a much longer time, about 70,000 years, to adapt to that place. And so our history here in the Americas is only about 20,000 years old, and we are the only humans to come into a brand new landscape. You can argue that Eurasia and Africa share plants, animals, bacteria, viruses, where the Americas were totally distinct with their plant and animal species and their microbiome. So again, we're different in all kinds of ways from the rest of the world. And this is recognized and has been recognized for quite a long time, going all the way back to the 1950s, that American Indians and indigenous people in the Americas are different and they're targeted as a resource. It began especially with tuberculosis, where lots of tuberculosis outbreaks were allowed to take their natural courses in American Indian populations, just so that they can sort of have guinea pigs and be able to make public health interventions for majority populations in European and United States countries. So yeah, I mean, and it's just been, I mean, there's so many research horror stories that have happened in American Indian spaces. I won't go into here. So the Native BioData Consortium is using the domestic dependent nation status of American Indians and their specific and private legal jurisdiction to keep samples and data local, build tribal capacity, foster trust in research, but mostly to leverage the data to benefit tribes, benefit research that tribes want to do, instead of having very sort of pie in the sky multi-input diseases like cancer or metabolic disease or those kinds of things. There are things that we can do with this data right now that would help the tribes more immediately in terms of making sure that their healthcare systems and their preventative health is attended to. So what we also want to do, which we're in negotiations right now with the federal government, is that things like the Common Rule and the Belmont Report were not made with American Indians in mind. They're made with sort of the Germans and their depredations on Jewish populations, or European Americans against Black Americans, like with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. But Indigenous ethics specifically hasn't really been developed or framed, and certainly the Common Rule is not superimposable on tribal communities at the moment. We also are trying to develop policy and law, and I just came back from Colombia, where we're trying to work with the UN and international systems of law and support to make sure that Indigenous data is useful and controlled by Indigenous populations. And then what we're always lacking, of course, is money in terms of sustainability. One of the biggest problems with American Indian research is that it's always on soft grant money. There isn't hard money. And we're trying to figure out how to get that going so that we don't have these gaps in research or gaps in implementation. If you don't know, I was part of Obama's American Recovery and Rehabilitation Act, and the NIH at that time had promised my bosses there at UW Seattle that capacity and training would definitely be included in the research dollars. And then later they said, no, they can't do that, that they would have to file a proposal with the NSF because the NIH doesn't do training. And then also in terms of money for ethics or legal review, that came later in terms of ELSI funding, which the NIH said you have to apply for those funds separately, which when you're from a small population like American Indian tribes, they can't afford or have the expert wherewithal to apply to 3 different federal programs to get the money to put in place a system that protects Native American data. So especially now with COVID, a lot of lines between data management and data restrictions have been laxed, and there's been a lot of cry from several different research communities that they like to have the curtains down, they like to have the partitions down, and they want to keep it this way. And there's lots of us that say, nope, you need to put the walls back up. COVID's, kind of over. And in fact, COVID has taught us some lessons that these walls need to be a little bit sturdier between these different data pools. So that's kind of a fight we're fighting now, especially with machine learning and AI. Is machine learning, portends to keep those sort of walls down at the moment because machine learning can go everywhere and see everything. We got here because of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, which, you know, most of the data and research that came out of the United States was funded by public tax dollars, and that sort of de-incentivized people from taking things all the way to development. So they gave the intellectual property licensing to universities, so not even the researcher doesn't get to claim anything. And that came to a head at the University of Wisconsin with Jamie Thompson with stem cell technology, where he's like, no, it belongs to me. And University of Wisconsin said, no, it belongs to us. And so he took all of his toys and he went to England, and they coaxed him back. And yeah, so there's not only a fight between, of course, populations like American Indians, but there's fights between researchers and the universities that they reside in. So the Bayh-Dole tried to clear that up. Then there was federal law HR 2272, which began in 2007, was just re-ratified here in 2022. Every year they've been adding more and more stuff to it, but it's basically making all publicly funded science and research open. So it started out with health research, but now it's even NASA and other kinds of research, physics, other disciplines besides biomedical research. And so this is just, I won't focus on this too much, but these are some of the things that are in there and some of the things that are not attended to. So it's supposed to connect funding to the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, which if you were paying attention, the first Black female director was Alondra Nelson, and she had a lot to say about the Artificial Intelligence Bill of Rights, but that seems not to have filtered much down into the rest of NIH, as this law says it should. And they're supposed to coordinate across different departments and HHS and other departments like EPA and CDC, NSF, all that kind of stuff, which also, in my view, hasn't seemed to happen. It connects to Standards Office for National Emergency Deployments, provides formalized access to education initiatives, meaning high school STEM programs and undergraduate programs. And then they guaranteed entrepreneurship for developers and manufacturers so that they can have access to this publicly generated information. Connects to the Department of Energy for national security and safety. Also, this was just in 2022. They made provisions for the auto industry and manufacturers of superconductors. And then this last one, 10, makes no sense to me, but somehow data has to be open so that they can move animal species around the world, which, you know, to me could spell ecological disaster, but they put it in there. This is just the timeline of America Competes. This is the specific language saying that you and I, who get federal money, have to make data open and has to be consistent with the Bayh-Dole Act. But all of these pieces of legislations, like I said at the beginning, haven't been done with consultation with tribes. So in 1975, they passed the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act of 1975 that basically allowed tribes to do these things for themselves. There's some problems in terms of funding for tribes to do these things for themselves. For instance, with the Indian Health Service, if a tribe wants to 638 their health service, they don't get all of the money. They only get 2/3 of the money, and the tribe has to come up with the rest of the money to take care of their health care. So if you don't know, in terms of constitutional and treaty law, all tribes in the United States, there's 574, are guaranteed education, they're guaranteed housing, they're guaranteed healthcare, and they're guaranteed, there's 4 of them, I'm forgetting, healthcare, education, housing, and I can't remember the 4th one. Anyway, they're guaranteed those things, and they can take them all over. And it says their data is only to be used by the federal government to basically ensure financial responsibility and protection for patients. but that's not being followed. It's certainly not being followed by this open data environment in terms of the NIH. And as I said, the consultation or the discussion of how these two laws, America Competes and the Indian Self-Determination Act, those conversations haven't been had. So again, this is just highlighting minimum health data, and research is only mentioned in the context of legal and budgetary research for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. The broader landscape for everybody in the United States is back in 2012, there's this whole fight about blood spots and whether or not these public health data can be used for general research. Indiana burned all their cards because they thought it was a overreach of the federal government. States like Minnesota restricted them to public health use only, not for biomedical research. But since then, I can't remember how many states it was. I think it's like 8 now. They've relaxed their position on public health blood spots for babies to allow them for basic genetic research. At the same time, during COVID, the state of Michigan passed a law to allow that medical waste could be used for biobanking at Michigan's public universities. It's always been in question on what medical waste could or could not be used for. And this kind of solidified that without consent or permission, this medical waste could be used for biobanking in Michigan. And then Baltimore and Maryland in general were subjects of an expose by a classmate of mine for selling the bodies of the homeless to big pharma at the beginning of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. So this thirst for information and ways around the common rule are happening more and more. This slide talks about how these states here have considered genetic privacy bills and passed them in 2021 and 2022, but they seem to be mostly directed at direct-to-market companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Some of them go a little bit further than that, but mostly it's the direct-to-market companies that these genetic privacy bills are aimed at. Montana just passed theirs in June, going into effect October 21st. And it talks about genetic data as broad, very broad, so it protects human genetic data from use without expressed written consent, especially for secondary data analysis or third-party analysis. And that businesses also, especially if you're a business that provides health insurance to your employees, also have to make sure that the data that they might want to use for genetic analysis be consented by their employees. Texas is a little bit different. They signed it into law in July, goes into effect September 1st, and theirs is definitely more strict. I mean, not more strict, but more specific than Montana. Montana is like any genetic data, and here they make exceptions for protected health information, covered entities like universities or businesses under HIPAA. So those people can use DNA, especially if it's de-identified, but other entities have to get consent before they use that data. And this just goes a little bit more into this. And I want to call your attention specifically to the second from the bottom. Establish a process through which an individual can access, delete, or destroy such data. And they're very specific about that. And some of these companies do give you that possibility and other ones don't. I myself was part of a Myriad analysis for my own healthcare, and they don't have any language in their contract about accessing my data or deleting my data. All it says is that they will use it for quality control, and they would deposit the results into my medical record for my physician to report to me, but I don't really have any control of my particular genetic data for the test that I underwent from Myriad. All of this to say that, again, these are constitutional and treaty rights, and the Clinton administration, Obama, and the Biden administration have all supported and strengthened the executive order that says anything, any new technology or new resource that was never ceded in treaty still belongs to tribes under the recognized reserved right of tribes, and that the tribes need to be consulted on anything that might affect their health, their environment, or their economics. And it really hasn't been done very well. Every federal department does it differently, and they all interpret this memorandum differently. So the federal policies, we've had tribal consultation policy back from 2010, the All of Us research policy from 2021, the new data sharing policy of this year with a tribal addendum, and the Indigenous Knowledge Policy from the OSTP. The first three give almost all of the control to the federal government to decide what is and what isn't consultation, and to have the ability to call a consultation into effect. And it doesn't really give tribes much control at all. And again, a lot of times consultation is notification. It's not a negotiation. So they don't respect the no of tribes. The Indigenous knowledge policy is a little bit better because it talks about Indigenous knowledge and protecting its intellectual property rights, and trying, making sure that researchers negotiate those intellectual property rights with the tribe. However, the definition of indigenous knowledge is very narrow, meaning that it's knowledge that was obtained in the past, that it has some cultural or ancestral connection, where many of us who are Native think that any knowledge or any data extracted from Native people is indigenous knowledge. So we want our data back. So we here at the NBDC have employed, with the help of University of Oklahoma, Paul Spicer, to do something called deliberation. And deliberation is something that's being used more and more in the European Union for things like fracking, where people suspected that there was too much of a relationship between corporations and political offices to give licenses or permits to do mining or drilling in certain areas without consulting local municipalities and their communities. So now they have these large town halls where the community has just as much voting rights as a large corporation to go forward or deny a mining operation. So we use deliberation for biomedical stuff. The partners that we work with, South Central Foundation, they did it on return of results. Chickasaw did it on biobanking. Here on Chine River, we did it on Indigenous data sovereignty. So deliberation merges two different fields of community engagement. So on the right, you have like CBPR, community-based participatory research, that talks about sort of basic research data, but doesn't really give communities much teeth in terms of not allowing something to go forward. Their input is taken and some things are modified, but ultimately the decisions are made by the researcher. That has been merged with democratic governance, especially for things like public health, and things where actual government departments have to make decisions on behalf of the community. And so deliberation has crossed those two different community engagements, so that not only is it less hierarchical, but there's cross-fertilization of knowledge between experts and the general community. So we use that here at the NBDC. Of course, these things have become at a fever pitch, especially with South Africa doing its due diligence to sequence the COVID variants, and then getting economically and physically harmed by travel restrictions. So now places like South Africa aren't necessarily want to partner with the European Union or the United States in sharing COVID information, because so far they've gotten burned every time they do in terms of new variants. So for tribal sort of the altruistic pitch for tribes is that they're giving us this data so that they can help, but there's a lot of problems with actually implementing data in Native communities. One of them is racism, second one's funding, third of them is this sort of pendulum swing in Congress on whether or not tribes are independent nations or not. We're always under threat of termination, just getting rid of the reservation system altogether. So you can give us this race car, but if we don't have a place to drive it and the experts to drive it, or if somebody else is holding the keys, it's not really building capacity or capability. And this is just saying this in a different way. There could be a lot of water to drink, but no way to get it. Again, making data available in the commons. Everybody can go and get their bottle of water, but there are companies and corporations taking the water out of the lake by the truckload. So we don't want to have the big data era represent what has been like this in terms of colonization since at least 1454. We want to make sure that open data environment's truly equitable. Again, this is just saying it a different way, where some of the world's populations have all kinds of luxuries and access and benefits from data, and other ones don't. So the tragedy of the commons is that public problems are funded with public tax dollars, but profits are usually only going to private corporations. And so that's kind of the tragedy of the commons. And we don't want to have open data to become the promise, which is on the left, that everybody's going to be able to sail their boat on a lot of data, and really having the data being sucked out of the lake and leaving most of us without a boat, without a lake to sail our boat on. So it's a human rights issue for many. We need more data discretion, data governance, data translation, and definitely data implementation. And if communities can have their own data, they can negotiate vital opportunities and funding outside the federal system, and they can decide on how they want to use their data to make more immediate impacts in their communities. And for us, it would be all under the umbrella of Indigenous data and sample sovereignty. These are just a couple of examples where Natives have gotten really harmed by federal policies. The Black Hills, where we are now, was ceded by treaty to the Sioux, but then once gold was found there, it was taken away from them, and the treaty was abrogated. And the tribes want to get the Black Hills back, and Obama was the last one to offer them 1.4 billion, but it's really worth about 340 billion, and tribes don't want they don't want the money, they want the land back. So that's something that's still happening. The Dawes Act kind of subdivided land on reservations among inheritors, and it wasn't managed very well by the federal government. And so the Cobell-Salazar lawsuit won tribes 3.4 billion, but what they were really owed was 176 billion. It turned out, like here locally, each tribal member only got $1,000, so it wasn't really much. And a lot of the 3.4 billion went to legal fees. So the tribes won this, but they didn't really get much out of it. So in terms of open data, we have to face the legacy of colonization and fundamental differences in worldview. In the Western view, winners must have losers, and usually Natives are the losers. And right now, open data, in terms of our perspective, it's the recapitulation of the doctrine of discovery. As I said, the Americas are unique in all kinds of ways, in plants, in humans, in rare earth minerals. And they're really being targeted for a lot of these things. If you didn't pay attention, Bolivia was the first country to have a big fine for lithium, and immediately the United States planned a coup and tried to go in there and take their stuff, but luckily that failed. Now Sonora, Mexico, and a whole bunch of Latin America, Argentina, they all have had these huge lithium finds, and the indigenous people, usually in indigenous lands, and the indigenous people are very worried what that means for their their inhabitants on the land. in terms of the past, we fed the world. Almost all the food in the world comes from the Americas. Corn, potatoes, cassava, which is tapioca, tomatoes, peanuts, guavas, chocolate, beans, sunflower, turkey, strawberries, all come from the Americas. And then the non-food products, cotton, most of the world's cotton is from the Americas by genetics, and tobacco. And none of that money is going to Native Americans. And then this is recently with Taxol. This was knowledge from Pacific Northwest Indians, both in Washington State and British Columbia. All the trees are gone. All of the money goes to like 4 different pharma companies, and there isn't any money going to Native Americans for that knowledge or that tree. I'll skip this. My boss, my mentor at University of Washington said, Joseph, if you want to protect tribes, you should probably tell Indigenous leaders to think bigger. They need to get away from traditional ecological knowledge and protect the whole plant, even the roots and the microbiome of that plant. For Taxol, it was a unique enzyme from the endophytic fungus under the bark of the Pacific yew tree that was discovered to make a levitory rotated chiral center. It's fundamentally changed the whole field of drug development. So again, tribes don't know these things, and they're only protecting part of their intellectual property instead of the whole thing. So the NBDC is a safe harbor. We've gotten lots of calls from different parts of the world to hold samples and data here. And especially with Indigenous groups like New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, and Australia want to put things with us because it's their data. We follow OCAP principles, which is ownership policies, ownership, which is manifested through policies, resolutions, ordinances, statutes, and laws, control manifested by tribal administrators, Native scientists, Native technicians, Native planners and grant writers, and Native lawyers, access, identifying and repatriating data that's out there, bringing it back here, and then we will grant data sharing permissions and access and rules. And then possession, by actually having the data and the samples here, gives us a lot of power and leverage. I'll skip this slide, but basically data governance has a lot of different parts, including stakeholder language and the final reason why the data is being collected. Not everybody's a data stakeholders, especially here in the Americas. We don't consider ourselves stakeholders. We are owners of the data. Not everyone has an equal stake, and nor equal power. And Indigenous people, especially in the Americas, are owed a great deal. The United States, because of this open data environment, has been advocating more and more for strengthening scientific integrity around data management and protecting data, especially for military and other economic security measures, to go towards zero trust, just like Google does, just like Microsoft does. So that there's sort of these cross currents going. One is open data and one is protecting data from people who might steal intellectual property or national secrets. So here at the Native BioData Consortium, we use traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels, which are sort of a stopgap measure to track data through space and time. Watermarking data, just like Google does. We've built a dynamic consent portal, which basically takes or digitizes institutional memory so that everybody remembers the rules and agreements, and nothing's going to be forgotten 20 years from now. And we keep track of all of that stuff digitally. Blockchain and ledger systems, federated and decentralized learning, where we don't need to use the cloud, and Dockerizing, containerizing access. So we are scientists. We can figure this out. We have an obligation to make things really fair if we're going to have open data. And there's some people working on this in terms of game theory. How do we get to win-win-win situations rather than win-lose situations? And this is just one paper, if you're interested, of how to get there. And to me, I think machine learning and AI represent a real threat, because we're still too young at this, and AI and machine learning is going to be very powerful, not only to collect data that's out there and publicly available, but also that a lot of the data is biased and bias towards European descended populations. So things like polygenic risk scores are going to be highly inaccurate and then employed in dangerous ways. And then for Native Americans, machine learning will be hyper revelatory and basically provide breadcrumbs to resources and populations that hadn't been exposed or revealed before to brand new intellectual property. So I'm dedicating this to my wife's cousin. She was a leader in American Indian law from the Big Fire Law Company in Omaha. She passed away in July 14th, and she was helping the NBDC and all of Indian country in the United States to win big federal cases to protect Indigenous data sovereignty. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Joe, thank you so much. I'd like to open this up to questions. We have about 10 minutes, and you can raise your hand or you can type in the chat. And while we're waiting for a question, Joe, I have a question for you about, I think you said in 2018 is when the Native BioData Consortium was opened, even though it had been conceived back in 2009. And I know one of the big accomplishments is training scientists and having a well-trained scientific group involved. You mentioned all the different parts of the planet that are represented by different people on your board. I was just wondering, like, what would you identify as, in addition to training scientists, what are some of the accomplishments that you've seen over the past 5 years, and what do you hope to see over the next few years?
So one of our more successful advocates is Maui Hudson. He's a Maori researcher from New Zealand, and it's really funny. So a lot of times when we're standing here waving our hands and saying, here we have American Indian researchers, people are like, there's no American Indian researchers to take all this grant money, which is not true. Or we can't find an American Indian scientist to engage with. Well, because people kind of fetishize the indigenous, they really like to listen to the Maori stories and the cultural aspects of the Maori culture and that kind of stuff. So Maui's been very successful at getting journals to relax their open data requirements, because a lot of time, at least since 2014, it's been hard for us to get things published because tribes don't want to share open data with the journal. Like they'll share the summary statistics at the end of the paper, but they don't want to make all the data open. And so it's been hard for like the Nature series of journals to let us publish. And so he went there and they allowed us to be there, and they weren't aware that he was bringing all of us with him, because they thought they were only going to meet with the Maori guy, and they ended up meeting with First Nation scientists and American Indian scientists. And then we got them to say, hey, you're going to let us publish. And so they did. They said they're going to relax their open data requirement for publication. So, and then he also did that with the NSF in terms of funding. They thought they were only going to meet this Maori guy, and then last minute, hurrah, Jack in the Box, you're meeting with American Indians in your own backyard. And so we got some of the restrictions for funding reduced, so that, again, about open data access, because that's really been an impediment for us to do things the way we feel we have to do them in order to protect and leverage native data. So that's been a success story.
That's a big success. Yeah, I was going to ask you about what the data management requirements are and how you negotiated that with different funders. So Sarah is about to drop, but she wanted to know what you would regard as a win with AI Ready or Bridge to AI, and what would represent good progress.
Yeah, so we've been talking to the program officers for Bridge to AI every month. And for me, I think a win would be to have this conversation about whether or not contract language between, say, an entity like the NBDC and Stanford is good enough to protect tribes. Because again, to me, I can't, as a, if this were a private business, or if, like we are a 501c3, I can't give over tribal data. It's inside tribal jurisdiction. It belongs to them. I can't give away their data. That would be like me walking in your house and selling somebody your television. I can't do that. And so with the NIH, they sort of don't understand that. Like, it doesn't matter who you are, University of Washington, University of Wisconsin, you can't agree to data sharing. That has to be a nation-to-nation negotiation. And so to me, the win is having these conversations and making sure that that conversation actually happens. This isn't something that can be handled with contract law. It has to be handled with treaty law.
Have you seen any progress in that, or a draft in development that would get a step closer?
I've been doing this since 2007, and it's always a re-education, just when we're getting to a point where we have a sort of critical mass of people at the NIH who understand this, they all, leave. They all get replaced by somebody else, and then we have to re-educate them again. So it'd be nice to have some sort of policy that lasts, again, going to institutional memory, that there's a policy in place that stays there over time.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Joe. And just Kelly's here with us for the HubMap meeting. So that's another NIH project that's trying to, again, they have this piece where there is this education piece, but it's still a data collection, data banking type of project. So kind of what you were saying, Joe, at the beginning of your talk, when Indigenous scientists or scientists who are interested in this type of advocacy come into play, having the expertise to do all this data, kind of like AI ready, but at the same time do it with all the advocacy and the policy building aside, would you suggest that as if NIH were to put out another proposal as big as this one, like now here they included ethics and teaming, is there anything else that we could include, or NIH should be thinking about to include to kind of go into these projects?
Well, yeah, so some of you might be aware that James Watson, when after the mapping of the human genome, said we have to have, I think he said 3% of every grant dollar be dedicated to ELSI, ethical social implications for genetic or biomedical research. And then the United States upped it to 5%. But then in the last, I don't know, probably 6 years, they've been wanting to get rid of ELSI altogether. But in that time frame, from 2003 until now, most of the ELSI money has been directed towards community engagement, getting people to understand informed consent and know what they're signing. And it's just been way too much focused on getting the signature, rather than looking at how to make the system more equitable. Like, how do we implement this? How do we get past a hospital's bottom line, or an insurance company's bottom line, or with us, Indian Health Services bottom line? How do we put this data into practice? So ELSI hasn't been focused on the right place. It's been focused on getting the signature and the consent form. So after COVID, in some of these meetings with NIH, they said that they understand that all of these barriers have been taken down between departments like the FDA and HIPAA and the Common Rule, and that this year, which I still haven't seen, this year was going to be a different landscape for ELSI, that they were going to be putting more money towards legal research. Like, how do we do this? How do we protect people, especially if we're using several different data sets simultaneously? And that hasn't happened yet. So they know that it's a problem, and they, at least back in March, they promised to put money towards it, but it hasn't happened yet. So for me, I would like to see the NIH actually do more research on the legal landscape of data sharing and consent form, especially with machine learning and AI, because like I keep saying, consent is not a contract. It's not a one and done. People have been talking about smart contracts and ledger systems so that the individual can control and track their data over time. And possibly their kids can do that too. You know, if you're using data 50 years in the future, who has control of that data? Should it be me? No, it should be a family member, or it should not be used anymore.
Yeah, and
Well,
this,
thank you again, Joe, for being our speaker for this month. I want to let everybody that know that Deborah Matthews is going to be our speaker for September. We will have a title for you probably within the next week. She will be presenting on the 19th of September, 12 o'clock, same time as this session. And we are recording these. We will be putting them up on the AI Ready website so that people can access them over time. And Joe, I think, you know, you've raised so many really important points, and I think there may be questions that arise after we close today. So if folks have questions, do you have a preference for how to receive them? Would Basecamp be a good place, or email, or do you have some?
Yeah, Basecamp, email, phone calls. I'm open to all of it. And again, I want to emphasize that there are these cross currents. So while the public policy, like for public tax dollars, they want to have this open data, states themselves are passing legislation to say you can't do that.
Yeah, we have a lot to think about with respect to the open data and how to convey to people who might choose to contribute to the repository what this means, because it's quite complex. Well, thank you all for being here. Aaron, I know that you and I think I saw Cecilia. There you are. Hi. Did you have anything that you wanted to say? I know that this is usually our all hands meeting. So is there anything you want to add today?
No, I don't have anything to add. We're in the home stretch of getting our NOA, I hope, and so that's sort of the only update I really have.
Thank you so much, Joe, for presenting. No, this is really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everybody have a good week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.